What if the people meant to love you most decided you weren't worth keeping? That was a cruel reality for Ethan, a boy of just 10, living in an upscale suburb outside Chicago. His parents, Mark and Susan, were the kind of people who lived by appearances. Their home gleamed with glass tables, spotless countertops, and a lawn trimmed so sharp it could have been in a magazine. But behind those tall white gates, love had become performance, not a truth. Ethan struggled in ways they couldn't accept. Numbers jumbled on the page. Letters seemed to float out of place. Tutors cycled in and out, armed with flashcards and sharp voices, while Ethan sat stiff at the kitchen island, tracing little circles into the granite countertop, hoping neat shapes might unlock his parents' approval. Mark hid his frustration behind financial reports. Susan pressed invisible creases out of her dress, as though order could erase her disappointment. There was no yelling, only silence so thick that even the ticking wall clock seemed to breathe disapproval. Ethan tried harder every week, but his small shoulders shook whenever someone barked focus, and he held his breath as if stillness alone could make the world line up correctly. The only gentleness in that cold house came from Margaret, the longtime nanny who had raised Ethan since he was a baby. She was the kind of woman who hummed old country songs while cooking chili, who slid cookies across the counter when no one was looking, and who turned homework into stories in shapes Ethan could touch. She saw how hard he tried, even when others only saw failure. But one Tuesday evening, the verdict fell. His father stacked papers on the counter. His mother wore that brittle smile she reserved for dinner parties. "It isn't working," she said flatly, more to the stone countertop than to her son. At the door sat a small duffel bag. Inside, a sweater still warm from the dryer, a pair of socks, and a toy airplane with one wing bent from too many carpet crashes. The front door opened. Cool suburban air spilled in, carrying the faint hum of sprinklers and the buzz of a distant lawn mower. Ethan's sneakers hovered at the threshold, his chest tight with fear, but the gate still closed behind him. He sank to the pavement, clutching the bag to his chest, his thumb running along the cracked wing of the toy plane like he might fix it if he were careful enough. From across the cul-de-sac, two neighbors paused at their mailboxes. One whispered, "Did you hear?" The other muttered, "Unbelievable." A jogger slowed just enough to glance before hurrying on, earbuds blasting louder than his conscience. To them, Ethan was just another kid on the curb, another shadow in the evening glow. But inside the house, Margaret's heart broke. She had raised other people's children for decades, but Ethan had always been different. She whispered a prayer, not for pity, but for courage. Then, with steady hands, she untied her apron, set the house keys on the counter, slipped into her worn sneakers, and stepped out into the night. She found Ethan shivering at the gate, scarf slipping loose. Without hesitation, she wrapped it tighter around his neck, the fabric smelling faintly of cinnamon from the kitchen. No promises, no speeches, just presence. She picked up his duffel, squeezed his hand, and said, "You're not alone." And so they walked away from the spotless White House and its gleaming gates, down a quiet suburban street lit by amber streetlights. The door clicked shut behind them, a soft sound, but final, the kind that ends one story and begins another. The streetlights buzzed faintly as Ethan and Margaret walked away from the pristine cul-de-sac. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't have keys jangling in her pocket, no security gate to buzz through, and no time card of a life not her own. She had stepped into uncertainty, but with purpose. Margaret had been with the family for a decade. She remembered Ethan as a baby, clutching her finger with surprising strength, his cries softening when she hummed old hymns from her church choir days. She had watched him grow through scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the quiet loneliness of a boy whose parents were always too busy. Leaving wasn't easy. Her paycheck, her housing, and her security had all been tied to that mansion, but she knew a truth her employers had forgotten. Children aren't disposable. They made their way to Margaret's modest apartment on the edge of town, far from the gated neighborhoods and manicured lawns. The building was older, brick weathered and cracked, but inside her small unit was warmth. A faded quilt draped across the couch. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with garlic and thyme. Family photos lined the shelf, none of them hers by blood, but all hers by love. Ethan clutched the toy airplane, staring wide-eyed at the space. He was used to sleek marble counters and gleaming hardwood floors, not mismatched chairs and a squeaky ceiling fan. Yet here, surrounded by Margaret's soft presence, he felt safer than he had in years. Margaret knelt to his level. "Ethan," she said gently, "I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I know one thing, we're in it together." Her words anchored him. For a child who had been treated as expendable, those simple syllables carried more weight than any mansion, any tutor, any glittering promise of wealth. The next days weren't easy. Margaret juggled extra shifts at a local diner, scrubbing dishes and carrying trays with a smile that hid her exhaustion. She clipped coupons, stretched every dollar, and leaned on the quiet kindness of her neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door dropped off bags of groceries by mistake. Mr. Howard, the retired teacher downstairs, offered free tutoring sessions in math, turning lessons into games that made Ethan laugh. For the first time, Ethan wasn't being scolded for failing. He was being guided, encouraged, and celebrated for every small step forward. Margaret's tiny apartment became more than shelter. It was proof that love didn't need wealth to feel abundant. Late one night, Ethan curled up on the couch, the quilt pulled to his chin. Margaret tucked him in, humming the same tune she had sung to him as a baby. The boy's eyelids fluttered, his breathing steadying. She lingered there, one hand resting on his shoulder, knowing she had made the right choice, even if the road ahead was uncertain. In the quiet, Margaret whispered a vow to herself, "I'll raise him as if he were my own, no matter how hard it gets." Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, bouncing through the city streets. Life was never easy in this part town, but inside that small apartment, surrounded by the glow of a second-hand lamp and the smell of simmering stew, a new kind of family was beginning, built not by blood or wealth, but by choice. And sometimes, choice is stronger than either. Ethan woke each morning in Margaret's apartment to the rattle of pipes and the faint smell of coffee drifting through the small kitchen. The apartment complex was noisy, kids shouting in the courtyard, someone's television blaring through the walls, but in that chaos was a rhythm he began to rely on. It was life, messy and real, and it held him steadier than silence ever had. School, however, remained a battlefield. Ethan carried the weight of his parents' rejection in the form of whispers. "Isn't it the kid who got kicked out?" Classmates muttered in hallways, their voices sharper than any slap. Teachers, though kin to them before, still grew impatient when he stumbled over reading passages or lost his place in math problems. But Ethan had changed. He no longer wilted under their stares. Instead, he dug in his heels. Margaret's voice followed him everywhere. "You're not alone. You're not broken." At night, after homework with Mr. Howard, Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, piecing together puzzles Margaret had found at a thrift store. Each finished puzzle felt like a triumph. Slowly, he learned that progress wasn't about being perfect. It was about refusing to stop. There were setbacks. One afternoon, after fumbling through a class presentation, Ethan overheard two boys snickering. "He talks like a baby." His chest burned, his fists clenched, and for a moment, the urge to cry felt overwhelming. But then he remembered Margaret's words, steady as bedrock. "You're stronger than what they say." He lifted his chin, walked past them, and refused to let their laughter follow him home. One evening, Margaret surprised him with a worn-out library card she had dug from her purse. "It's yours now," she told him, placing it in his hand. Together, they walked to the neighborhood library, a red brick building with creaky wooden doors and the comforting smell of paper. Ethan wandered the aisles, running his fingers along the spines. Margaret chose books carefully. Stories about kids who struggled, who stumbled, but who also found ways to rise. Ethan devoured them, one halting word at a time. Slowly, something shifted. The boy who had once been cast out as a burden began to carry himself differently. His shoulders squared. His voice gained steadiness. He started answering questions in class, even when unsure. Sometimes he was wrong, but sometimes he was right. The turning point came during a school-wide science fair. Ethan and Mr. Howard had spent weeks building a model of suspension bridge out of popsicle sticks and glue. The project wasn't flashy compared to the robotics and solar-powered gadgets other kids displayed, but it was solid, carefully crafted, every piece connected just right. When it was his turn to explain, Ethan's heart pounded. His voice wavered at first, but then he remembered Margaret standing in the back of the gym, her eyes steady on him. "This bridge," he said, holding it up carefully, "works because even when weight pushes down, the cables and beams spread the pressure so nothing snaps. It bends, but it doesn't break." His words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. For a moment, the room hushed. Then a few claps began. Then more. Ethan didn't win first prize, but he walked off that stage taller than he had ever felt, because he knew, like the bridge he had built, he could bend under pressure and still not break. That night, as Margaret tucked him into bed, Ethan whispered, "Do you think I'll be okay?" Margaret kissed his forehead and answered without hesitation, "You already are." And in that small apartment, under the soft hum of the ceiling fan, Ethan believed her. For the first time, he believed it too. Change rarely arrives with fanfare. Sometimes, it begins in the quietest corners, a single act of courage that sparks something greater. Margaret and Ethan's choice to stand together, though small in the vast city, began to ripple outward in ways they never imagined. It started with the neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had already been slipping groceries to Margaret, began inviting Ethan over to help in her garden. She taught him how to plant tomatoes, how to tell when the soil was thirsty, and how to take pride in coaxing life from the dirt. Watching Ethan kneel in the soil, his hands streaked with earth, the other neighborhood kids grew curious. Soon, 2 more joined him. The laughter of children echoed in the courtyard, something the building hadn't heard in years. Then there was Mr. Howard. Inspired by Ethan's determination, he began offering tutoring to more children in the building. At first, only 1 or 2 showed up. By the end of the month, a dozen kids gathered around his kitchen table, pencils scratching, eyes lighting up when they grasped a new concept. What had once been a lonely retirement turned into a mission fueled by a boy's resilience. Word spread beyond the apartment complex. At church, Margaret shared Ethan's story. Not the rejection or the pain, but the courage it took for him to keep showing up, to keep learning. Parents listened, nodding, some wiping tears from their eyes. One mother, who had been struggling with her daughter's learning challenges, pulled Margaret aside afterward. "If Ethan can rise after everything, maybe my girl can too." Even at Ethan's school, the ripple was felt. Teachers who once dismissed him as too difficult began to reconsider. His science fair bridge, though simple, became a talking point in the staff room. They saw in him not just a boy who struggled, but a boy who refused to quit. Slowly, expectations shifted, not just for Ethan, but for others like him. The biggest surprise came one Saturday afternoon. Margaret and Ethan returned from the library to find a group of neighbors gathered outside the building. A mural was being painted on the old brick wall, bright blues, reds, and golds coming together under careful hands. At the center was an image of a bridge stretching across a river, strong and unbroken. Above it, in bold letters, were the words, "We bend, we don't break." Ethan froze, his eyes wide. "That's my bridge," he whispered. Margaret squeezed his hand. "It's everyone's bridge now." In that moment, Ethan understood. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to the community, a testament to what could happen when one child and one woman refused to accept that love was conditional. That night, as music and laughter filled the courtyard beneath the mural, Margaret looked around and realized something profound. By saving one child, she had helped awaken an entire neighborhood. It wasn't wealth or power or status that changed the world. It was choice, and their choice had begun to ripple far beyond what either of them had dreamed. Years had passed since that night on the sidewalk. Ethan, once the boy who struggled with letters and numbers, had grown into a young man with a reputation that reached far beyond his modest neighborhood. His tech startup, built from scratch on a second-hand laptop, had grown into a company that created tools for underserved communities, apps that tracked budgets, helped students study, and gave local businesses digital platforms they couldn't afford otherwise. On the night of his biggest product launch yet, the event hall in downtown Chicago shimmered with excitement. Reporters, investors, and tech enthusiasts crowded the space. Screens displayed Ethan's name, glowing as brightly as the city skyline outside. And then, through the entrance, walked two familiar figures, Mark and Susan. Older now, lines of age etched into their once perfect faces. They moved with the quiet arrogance of people accustomed to privilege. Whispers spread like wildfire. Are those his parents? Didn't they disown him? Why are they here now? Ethan's heart didn't race with anger. It thumped with the weight of choice. He glanced toward the back of the stage, where Margaret stood quietly, her gray-streaked hair tucked under a scarf, her hands folded, her eyes steady. She had believed in him when no one else did. His parents stepped forward as he concluded his speech about innovation and resilience. Susan's voice, polished and calm, carried across the hall. We only push you away to make you stronger. We always knew you had greatness in you. Mark nodded, clapping lightly on Ethan's shoulder, as though they had built this empire together. The audience offered polite applause, but Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Margaret. He lifted the microphone. His voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the murmurs. You say you made me strong. The truth is, you left me on a sidewalk when I was just a boy. If anyone made me strong, it was someone else. A hush fell over the hall. Cameras clicked. Margaret stepped forward slowly, her hand in Ethan's. This, he said, raising her hand high, is my real family, the one who never gave up on me, who believed when no one else did. Every success, every invention, every headline, it belongs to her. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Some rose to their feet, his parents' faces drained of color, their attempts to claim his achievements unraveling under the weight of truth. Margaret's eyes glistened, but her smile radiated pride and love. Ethan's journey had come full circle. The boy who had been discarded, mocked, and underestimated had become a man who lifted others while honoring the one person who had never abandoned him. Family, he realized, isn't defined by blood. It's defined by those who refuse to let you fall, who choose to stay when the world walks away. As the hall buzzed with admiration, Ethan turned to the audience. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who change it forever. And with that, his story, built on resilience, sacrifice, and unwavering love, was complete.